go ahead and turn our Bibles to Luke chapter 17, verse 26. And when you get there, if you could say amen. And as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man.
Hello and happy Sabbath, and Feliz Sábado. Today is my first sermon ever. Amen. I would like to personally thank my family and my parents for helping me write this sermon and to show their support. And I'll also try not to talk so fast because I tend to ramble. I remember when I was in the 4th or 5th grade, and my parents were very conservative about the things I watched. They really wanted to make sure that I didn't watch anything inappropriate. And the number one thing they didn't want me or any of my brothers to watch was anything that was rated R. And yet, in the 4th and 5th grade, the biggest thing that everyone talked about, I think came out during 2004, I think around that time, was the movie 300. Does anyone remember 300? Okay, I've seen a few head nods. And the movie, which was based on a book, which was based on the actual historical event, was about 300 soldiers, Spartan men, and the movie was unbelievably graphic. I mean, it was violent as heck. And everyone was talking about it. And even before I saw it, just seeing the poster, how it was kind of dark and grimy, and the soldiers were like giving that warrior scary face, I was like, how could anyone watch this? But I'm seeing kids saying, quoting the movie and talking about how awesome it was, but I didn't get why they were allowed if they were too young. And funny thing, when I worked at the Dollar Tree, and I was cashier at the time, I met a guy who said that he saw the Deadpool movie and in theaters, and he said he brought his daughter with him, kind of his little girl. And I was like, why would you take your little girl to see a rated R film? And it wasn't just it was violent, it had so much adult themes, and it had language. Like, I can understand any adult watching it, but to bring their kids with them? And he was like, and he told me, well, I told my daughter, it's just a movie. It's just a movie, don't worry about it. And he's funny. And even though it wasn't a rated R film, we went to Universal Studios, and I wanted to go into the haunted house. And I remember there was his mother who brought her kids with her to this haunted house. And the kids were crying like, it's too scary, I don't want to go. And the mother is like, well, there's something wrong with you then. I was like, these are kids. But it kind of shows, it's scary that grown-ups are taking their kids to see these mature and dark movies and forms of entertainment because they can't bother to either stay at home and wait to rent the movie and watch it privately or get a babysitter. And as I got into middle school, another thing that I was told never to do was curse, of any sort. Again, parents very conservative. They didn't want me to indulge in anything inappropriate. But in middle school, just about every conversation and joke had a curse word. Of all the colors of the rainbow, maybe not all of them, because they didn't want to insult that many people, but sure enough. And at first I was like, well, why is everyone cursing? Well, because their parents were okay with it, and they're okay with it, and the teachers are not going to be there to tell them, don't curse. And though when I was in middle school, I said to myself, If I can't beat them, I might as well join them. So sure enough, I cursed and everyone laughed and so on. Looking back, I guess I'm not particularly proud of it, but it was one of those ways how I felt like I could fit in because everyone else was doing it and I wouldn't get in trouble for it, as long as I didn't do it in class. And going back in my younger years, and this was something that my mom had to deal with, and that was the teachers and the counselors and even some of her friends said to her, you know what's the best way for your sons to connect with other students and connect with other kids their age? Why don't you let them watch something, I think it was Law and Order, like that, a few cop shows that had some pretty violent scenes by finding dead bodies, and let them read books like Harry Potter, with witchcraft and all that dark stuff, because it was super popular, like really popular. And as well as one of Nathan's friends, I think it was one of his friends, who was Jewish, said to her, let's have Nathan have fun on Saturday, like go out, play a couple of games, do something fun. But she said to him or her, well, it's Sabbath, and you're Jewish, right? So shouldn't you understand the importance of the Sabbath? This person said, sometimes we have to make sacrifices for our kids. Sometimes we have to make changes for our kids. So it kind of shows that in the past, a lot of people, I think a lot of parents would have been much more conservative with what we did and what we shouldn't do, what we shouldn't watch, what we shouldn't say. But I'm seeing more and more adults being much more comfortable with letting their kids watch these movies and say these words, and even if they were religious, kind of break their own religious standards or God's law because, well, it's for the kids. It makes me look back during the early 20th century. You know how Elvis is like a big American icon right now? Like a big American icon? Well, back then, he was considered the most risque singer and dancer. And even look back at how, in the past, everyone would leave their doors open, and they wouldn't worry about people breaking in. But now we all lock them. We're scared that someone is going to come in. But before, we had no worries. So many things have been accepted or rejected are now being reversed. But regardless of if there are no wars right now and there's no crime, we're seeing signs of the end of days. And one of the warnings that Jesus told us was in Luke 17:26. And as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. But what was it like in the days of Noah, hypothetically speaking? Well, in Genesis 6:5, and God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination and the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every thought and action that they felt and did was only selfish, violent, cruel, and rebellious against God. So, for me to see so many adults being comfortable with letting their kids watch these things and say these things, it teaches them to be comfortable with the darkness. It teaches them that even if you watch something or read about something that is ripe with evil, and just say, oh, it's just fiction, it's for the little kids. It's got a cute, there's a little mouse with little devil horns, but he's a mouse, he's cute. It teaches them to be comfortable with the darkness. And even if it's not in our entertainment, it's also within our community, within our states, within this country, that talks about what we are willing to accept and teach our kids. In our modern times, there is conflict between what man wants and what God wants. But man wants nothing to do with God. And even though everyone has their opinions about what should be done and what we teach our kids, many would say we're doing okay, for the most part. Not great, but we live in a country that respects our rights, and for me, I am very, very glad that I live in a country that respects my rights, my freedom of speech, and my religion. I'm very happy about that, because there are no laws that says you either do this or you die. So why is this subject important? Because of how many people are trying to push away God in favor of their own standards. That they will end up like in the days of Noah. And that this lukewarm period that we're in will be short-lived. And I believe this because it has happened before. Throughout history, we have gone up and down, between everything being pretty good, to rock bottom, to getting out of that bottom and entering into a good playing field. But it's bounced constantly. And throughout the Bible, there have been kings who have forced their rule over the people. Many of God's servants were affected by it. In the book of Daniel, when Babylon took the Hebrews, brought them to Babylon, and taught them their language, their laws, and even their religion, Daniel and even his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, more commonly known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all had to struggle with having to keep their faith in God's law, even though King Nebuchadnezzar, through one way or another, had threatened them with death, as well as even when Nebuchadnezzar was out of power, and Belshazzar became king, and then he was booted out. Then came King Darius. And even though he and Daniel were pretty good, King Darius had signed a law stating that for 30 days, every single man, woman, and child is to worship him. And if you didn't follow the law, you were threatened with death. Hananiah, Zechariah, and Mishael was also threatened with death if they did not bow to Nebuchadnezzar's golden idol. One through fire, and with Daniel with the lions. And in the story of Elijah, he was the only prophet of God still alive after King Ahab, I believe, King Ahab, had ordered all of the other prophets of God murdered and killed. And throughout Elijah's life, he was a fugitive. He had to run away into the wilderness. And I look at this story, and I think it's scary that when he finally said to the king, "Let us meet and see whose God is real," that Elijah was the only one supporting God, and the priest of Baal had over 300. Imagine how terrifying it is having to see that many people saying, "Yeah, we got more followers than you. You are but a tiny leaf, surrounded with rocks that can easily roll you over." But even if there were no kings and there were no prophets that outnumbered you, even the Israelites had tried to follow their own path and do whatever they wanted to do. Moses, when he went up the mountain, was gone for 30 days. And that was enough for the Israelites to be terrified, to get scared. Moses has abandoned us. God has abandoned us. We need to have our own God, one that we can see, one we can touch. And even Aaron, the man who spoke for Moses against Pharaoh, the most powerful man in Egypt, build the golden calf for them because he might have been afraid of what they may have done to him, or he was afraid they might leave. And in the story of Hosea, he was the only man who still worshiped and prayed to God, even when every single person made a conscious choice not to. He was basically alone. He probably had no one to talk to. And even when God told him to marry Gomer, who had no love for him and went with other men, it was devastating because he had no one to go to. He was completely alone, and even though God was still with him, I can't imagine the amount of stress and depression he had to endure. Because as soon as he goes to his next door neighbor and says, "Will you pray with me because my wife is with some other man," they'll probably say to him, "Dude, I want nothing to do with your God. And whatever happens with you and your wife, that's your problem." It's heartbreaking. And we even look throughout history that even when Christianity, after so much persecution from the Romans and the Jews, when Christianity finally became the number one religion and just exploded with followers and priests and so on, Europe has gone through a dark age where the church tried to change the law of God to try to convert as many people as possible. That many of the saints that they said, "Oh, you can pray to them," some of them were not real people. They were pagan gods, but just relabeled as saints. So if you were Slavic, and you became a Christian, and you said, but what about my gods? They would say, oh, your gods, they're saints. Yeah, you know, they're on God's side. Don't worry about it. We get a man named Martin Luther who saw the lies, who knew that what the church was preaching and teaching were lies. And he made sure that everyone knew this and nailed a sheet of paper that tells them of the lies that the church has taught. And he got into a lot of trouble for it. As well as the Waldensians. Now, I never heard of them, but before I wrote this, my dad introduced them, or told me about them, and how during the 12th century, the Waldensians wanted to read the Bible in the comforts of their home. They wanted to pray in private. They wanted to learn God. But during the Dark Ages, the church knew that if people started studying the Bible their way, they might end up challenging their positions. Like, you say this, but the Bible says this. So they made it so that the Bible, that the book was not made public, and that you have to go to them, and they would say, because you couldn't understand it. The Waldensians wanted to learn the Bible for themselves in the comforts of their home and in their own private homes, and the church persecuted them for it. You know, probably through all matters of hunting them down and capturing them, and probably many of them were probably sentenced to death for it. People have tried to either force others to reject God, to turn away from God, and or change God's law to meet their standards. There are atheists today who are doing everything they can to keep Christianity away from the state. There is an amusement park called Noah's Ark in Kentucky, and the people who made it use the state's taxpayers' money to help build it. And there were tons of atheists who were angry with the signs and telling them that you used government's money for a religious reason. But the one thing they got most upset about, it wasn't just they built an ark, but that this ark teaches kids and other people creationism instead of evolution. I think for the most part, you know, atheists and evolutionists would have been fine if they just built an ark, put a couple of animals in there, you know, just for the kids. But to teach kids that the earth is only 6,000 years old, that dinosaurs did in fact go into the ark, and that we can explain how the Ice Age happened, that gets a lot of atheists upset. And you go on the internet and you look up creationism versus evolution, you know, atheism versus Christianity, argument over philosophy and science. You're going to see a lot of people getting on the fence about it. And if you look this up on YouTube and you scroll down the comments section, there's a lot of people saying, you know, you Christians are stupid. You Christians believe in a dead idea. You know, the book was written by some guy who suffered heat stroke. You know, if Moses saw a burning bush, you know, he was probably hallucinating. Probably drank bad water. Probably the smell of the sheep made him a little fuzzy. undermining the value of the Bible, and even teaching others that God is evil. For me, it's one thing if people doubt the Bible because they have not found God. It's another thing if they were taught evolution at a young age, and it's hard for them to kind of see anything beyond scientific studies or theories, as I still see them. But it's another thing when there are atheists who go so far as to say that your God hates you, that because you just fell a little short, he hates you. That if you were just not a good enough person, or if you didn't follow every law, you will burn. If you did this, or you did that, or you love this person, or so on, he will hate you for it. The anchorman, I forgot his name, but he's pretty popular. He does discussions with other atheists and Christians over God, not just with evolution, but also with morals. And he is not shy in letting everybody know that he hates God. I have friends who are atheists. Well, one's an agnostic and the other one's an atheist. But they never give me trouble. They let me believe what I get to believe, and I let them believe what they want to believe, and we never cross paths. We never get angry with one another. We've had interesting conversations, but it never led to either of us waving our finger. But man, there are so many atheists that are just anti-God. And I think they would find nothing more happier than for us to have nothing to do with how to run a country and to teach our children, or to make us look so small by comparison. There's talk I heard of an atheistic church, and I think that's hilarious. And funny enough, when I was looking on the internet, because I was curious about how many modern religions are there, and as I was scrolling down the list, atheism turned out to be one of them. And I didn't understand. It made me kind of understand that in a way, even though atheists don't have a God, they are trying to push away our religion for theirs. The Catholic Church is trying to gain the respect of the people by speaking false information of the Bible. On YouTube, I subscribed to Amazing Facts TV, and Doug Walker, Doug Batchelor, I'm thinking of two Dougs. Doug Batchelor talks about what the Pope is saying. And many of the things in our modern times that the Pope is saying is contradicting the Bible. This, to me, doesn't lead so much surprise, because the church has done that before. Either try to include as many people to their beliefs as they can, or to scare you. But because the church does not have power, not as much power as they did in the past, they're trying to influence as many people. And as I stated in the beginning, our entertainment are saying things like, do what thou will, and follow your own path. Even if kids are not watching rated R movies, they're not watching horror films or anything scary, they're watching films that are teaching them, essentially, do whatever you want to do as long as you're a good person. We've seen that a lot in many kids' cartoons and many of our modern-day movies. One in particular was called Ready Player One, where, like many of these movies that are coming out, something good is happening, but there's a big bad guy who wants to take control of everything. And the heroes have to rebel against this tyrant. And a lot of rebellious movies as well, funny enough. And the movie was based on a book. And the book said things like, God is no different than Peter Pan, the Tooth Fairy, or Santa Claus. It even went on to say, sorry kids, Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus are not real either. So you kind of start to see that they are teaching kids, take charge of your life. But it's out of do whatever you want to do. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And that seems to be the strongest motivation for why many atheists are trying to push away God's law and Christianity. Because many of the responses that they give is, life is how you want to make it. And I'm not doing anything wrong, like killing, stealing. So why should I follow God? And God has no relevance, things change, and we can only get better. Human beings aren't perfect. We can only be better over time, So what's the worries? Jesus said in Luke chapter 7, 22 to 24, "The days will come when you will desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it. And they will say to you, look here, look there. Do not go after them, nor follow them. For as the lightning that flashes out of one part under heaven shines to the other part under heaven, so also the Son of Man will be in his day." There is a common phrase that was said by Saint Augustine, I believe that's how you pronounce it, during the 4th century. When in Rome, do what the Romans do. The phrase, from what I've looked up, has 3 meanings. To give tourists free rein to indulge in feasting, to follow the local customs and traditions when in foreign countries, and to say to the following that the status quo seems like the best idea to take. Basically, if everybody else is doing it and you can't change it, well, what's the point in fighting? My question is, how much are we going to follow the Romans before we start turning away from God? That's not to say that we should just, knock on our president's door and say, we're not going to pay taxes, we're not going to follow your law because we don't like it. Because Jesus makes it clear that you should respect the country that you're in. And we can see throughout the Bible, as well as Joseph, when he was sold into slavery and he had to learn the language and the laws and the customs of the Egyptians, the only thing he did not do was worship their gods or broke any of the laws that God told Joseph not to do. Even when Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, even when he was the servant, the slave, and he had no rights or jurisdiction, he told her no, because it is a sin against your husband and against God. And sure enough, she had him thrown in prison for it. Daniel, again, learned the language, the laws, and wore their clothing. The only thing he did not do was eat their food and worship their gods. But when you look at these people who had to dealt with ridicule, with pain, with jail time, with so many things, all of them ended up becoming favored and loved and supported by God. Joseph, despite being thrown in prison, became the second most powerful man of Egypt. Daniel was beloved by so many people in Babylon. He was the wisest man of Babylon and more. So much that the other wise men and the princes and the magicians hated him. And that's why they tried to have the king write a law saying, we shall worship the king, because they knew that that would get Daniel in trouble. And even when they tried throwing him in the lion's den, Daniel was not only alive, but he came back unscratched. Not too long ago, I was fired from my job because I said I would not work on Saturday, even when it was mandatory. The job was in Santa Rosa, and it seemed like the perfect job for me. They said, we get Saturdays and Sundays off, which sounds awesome, because I finally get Sundays off, and most of my friends and family are available. The job seemed like a step-by-step learning process that I knew I can learn over time. They had a cafeteria, and the food was great. I did not want to leave. If the company that helped me found this job, Aerotech, they asked me, could you stay for a year? And after working there for a couple of weeks, I said, yeah, it's a great job. However, I was informed that there were going to be mandatory Saturdays because the job was essentially making tubes for the heart. It was a medical kind of job. And this was a really bad time for me to come in because the machines were breaking down and everyone was behind schedule. We had to re-clean the parts. We had to take out old parts and put in new ones. And even before that happened, I was informed of mandatory Saturdays, and I went up to my boss and I said to him, are there mandatory Saturdays? He says, yes. I says, if there's going to be mandatory Saturdays, I can't work because it's Saturday. It's my Sabbath. Or I try to simplify by saying I'm going to church, and he says, well, what time can you get off? And so I had to explain to him the Sabbath, and he said to me, right now, don't worry about it. Things will be okay, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Well, sure enough, eventually we did cross that bridge. And he said to me, you have to come in. And I said to him, I can't come in. It's my Sabbath. And he says to me, if you can't come in, then don't come in at all. But just to let you know, there are plenty of other people who can do this job, who can come in on Saturdays when we need them to. So it's up to you. Of course, I wasn't going to bend, though I did question myself if I should. I talked to so many other people at work, and they would say things like, well, you do what you got to do. We say you should work, but do what you got to do. Other people said that because you're religious, they can't kick you out. So and so you should bring this up. And during lunch, I prayed that I would get a chance to keep this job and not have to work Saturdays. I would be more than happy to work on Sundays if it meant I did not have to work on Saturdays, which I didn't understand why that wasn't an option. But I prayed and I contemplated and I said to myself, they told me that it was only going to be a couple of Saturdays, and after those Saturdays, I can finally get the rest of the Saturdays off. But it made me think what Daniel probably contemplated when he thought, it's only 30 days of saying, oh, king, you have a great crown, oh, you have the whitest teeth ever, I just have to kiss up to him, and I'll be scot-free. But Daniel knew that by just the action of compromising with having to break God's law, breaking the first law, and my job was asking me to break the fourth law, Daniel said no. And Daniel opened the windows and he prayed out to God. He knew it would get him in trouble. He could have just locked all the doors, kept the entire room dark and prayed, but no, he was proud. He wanted to make sure that this law, this king, these wise men who are going to get me killed, I'm not afraid of them. I'm not going to bend for them because they made it a law. And by the end of the day, when I left work, the guy on the front desk says to me, give me your card. In order to get in, I have to swipe in. And he said, give me your card. And I gave it to him, and of course, I didn't entirely know if it meant I was fired, so of course I stayed, and I'm like, are you going to give me anything else? Am I going to get back? He says, no, I was just told to take your card. That's how I knew I was fired. And of course, I got really, really angry. Why is this so hard to get a job that just respects my faith? I just asked for Saturdays off. I was willing to work on Christmas. I was willing to work on Sundays if they needed me. I was willing to do overtime. I just didn't want to work on Saturdays. I didn't want to work on Sabbath. And the funny thing is that they know they couldn't fire me for religious reasons. So they said that the reason why I got fired was because I was talking out loud. And that made some people feel uncomfortable. So it goes to show that people will find ways to try to kick you out, mock you, ridicule you of whatever kind, even if it's not in your face. However, no matter what challenges or persecutions will be thrown at us, no matter how much people will try to reject and shame us, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, 10 through 12, "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for these is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they, the prophets, which were before you." Thank you. Dear Heavenly Father,
I pray for those who are here and for those who are not here. I pray for all of us to become closer to you.
Amen.
I pray for you to give us the wisdom that you gave to Solomon. I pray for you to give us the courage that you gave to Daniel. And I pray for every single man, woman, and child who will deal with the hardships of man's world. I pray that when the times come where there will be so much conflict, so much hate, so much violence, so much cruelty, that we will be strong enough, that we will be able to be protected by your love. And we pray for any of our friends or relatives or even neighbors, and even our enemies, to find you, to become closer to you, to understand you. As your name, amen.
Amen.